Introduce Simon Pirani, one of main organizers of Fair Free London, who'll be speaking first. And then we have Lisa Hopkinson, who's sitting in the audience currently, and then Daniel Randall, who is an activist in the RMT Transport Union. So without any further ado, Simon.
Now, I'm going to set the scene with 4 points about the aims of the campaign, where it came from, what we've learned so far, and what we hope to get out of today's event. So, aims of the campaign: free public transport is first and foremost a social justice measure. It opens the city to millions of its citizens, including those who are limited in what they can do, where they can go, and even what they can eat by poverty. London has the greatest income and wealth inequalities in the UK, the richest people and the wealthiest corporations, and also a greater proportion of households in poverty, 25%, than any other region except Northeast England. Making public transport free would strike an immediate blow at social inequality and provide mobility to those lowest income families who are the least likely to have cars and the most likely to suffer from the health effects of a car-centered transport system. Free public transport also, secondly, addresses climate change. It can be combined with policies to minimize car journeys, to reduce the volume of traffic, and that is the sort of drastic demonstrative action that's needed to avert dangerous global heating. So by concentrating on policies that combine action on climate with social justice in this way, I hope we can counter the false political discourse that climate policies cost ordinary people money. And Drew and Pearl will say more about this relationship between social justice and the climate issue in the second session. Second, where the campaign came from. So we were here in the Waterloo Action Centre in February at a meeting where we set this campaign up, and that meeting was called by the Stop Silvertown Tunnel Coalition, which had been campaigning since 2018. We did not succeed in stopping the tunnel, and along with other local groups, we continue to call on the mayor to consider alternative uses for the tunnel, which is going to open next year. But we continue to send the emails and the call for it not to be used for motor traffic, to be used for public transport and walking and cycling. The point here is that fighting against investment in road project and fighting for investment in public transport are two sides of the same coin. And this is not just about London. Our friends in the Transport Action Network have just made a submission to the review of transport infrastructure. They're going to cost at least £15 billion, probably a lot more, to be cancelled. Top of the list is the monstrous 6-lane Lower Thames crossing, which has no place in 21st century transport policy. So not only City Hall, but national government, we are combating people who prioritize investment in new roads over investment in public transport, cycling and walking. That is the policy choice. Furthermore, together with people campaigning for health, education, parks, libraries, other public services, we are challenging the principles on which spending decisions are made. And when people ask us, where's the money going to come from for free public transport? That's a political choice. There's plenty of places. We listed them in our campaign brief. Okay, third, what we've learned so far. First thing we learned is that others are ahead of us. There's been campaigning for free public transport in Glasgow for several years. Ellie, who's online with us, will talk about that in a later session. Here in London, Citizens UK have been campaigning for the last couple of years for free bus travel for refugees and asylum seekers. The Student Union at the University of Arts London is demanding discounted rail fares for the growing number of students who can't afford to live in London and spend up to £100 a week travelling to lectures. A second thing we've learned is that workers at Transport for London support making public transport free, and Dan will talk about that. And another thing we've learned is the extent to which free public transport is spreading around the world, and you'll hear about that in the international session. So finally, what we hope to get out of today's event. So first thing is Fair Free London does not want to duplicate what other organisations are doing. Rather, the hope would be that the principle of free public transport will get embedded into much bigger and older organisations than ours, whether trade unions, community groups, transport campaigns, environmentalist groups or others. Now, and as you've heard in the introduction, some of those are represented here, so we should think about that. Second, we are acutely conscious that the situation with public transport investment outside London is much worse. And Lisa will talk about that next. We see our campaign running parallel to all those fighting for improved services and for provision as a public service. And we're committed to joining forces with them, no contradiction. Thirdly, we want to push the message out beyond the usual political spaces into communities. Setting up borough-level groups would be one way of doing this, but that, like everything else, is up for discussion. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you very much for inviting me here today. Lovely to be in London, and thanks for inviting me to the conference. My name's Lisa. I'm from Transport for Quality of Life, live in Derbyshire, and I'm going to be speaking on fare-free buses in England today. But a lot of what I'm going to say today is also very applicable to your campaign for fare-free public transport in London. Next slide, please. Oh, do I do the slides? Oh, okay. Yeah, next slide, please.
Is that right, Lisa? That's the next slide.
Yes, that's fine. Yes. So firstly, I'm just going to show you a holiday slide. Don't worry, this is the only one. So this is Austria. This is where we went to in summer. And the reason we went there, apart from the fact that it's absolutely spectacularly beautiful, is the public transport is absolutely brilliant, unlike most places in the UK. Next slide, please. And apart from being absolutely brilliant, I want me to do the slides. Would that be?
There's a slight delay, that's all.
But, sorry, that's okay. Yeah. So apart from the fact, as well as the fact that the public transport is very brilliant, in many parts of Austria, the public transport is also free for visitors, especially. And so in two of the places we went, we had free access to buses and ski lifts via these cards, which were provided by our accommodation providers, and they were paid for by a tourist tax. And this made public transport very accessible. It made our visit very enjoyable. And it means we'll probably go again to Austria to visit, or places like Austria. Next slide, please. But it's not just Austria. In England, we're going to talk about the international examples. I'm sure Jerome and the other speakers will talk about those, and Ellie will talk about Scotland. Even in England, there are examples of free buses. So, for example, in Sheffield, there's a free city bus that operates 7 days a week. In the Lake District, the Wasdale shuttle bus operates in summer for visitors and hikers. In Wakedale, there's a free city bus that operates Mondays to Saturdays. And in Hereford City, there's also electric buses that move around the city. And in Herefordshire, the county, last autumn, all buses were free every weekend in the whole county. So there are already examples out there. Next slide. And let's not forget that buses are already free for older people and disabled people throughout the UK. So if you're 66 in England and Wales, and if you're lucky enough to live in Scotland, London, or Northern Ireland, it's 60, get free buses. And this costs about £722 million a year to subsidise. Next slide, please. So why do we want free buses? Well, this report by the Institute for Global Prosperity at UCL, they did this report and set out the case for free universal basic services for 7 services, including public transport. And the reason for this is obviously because of social justice, and also because of the whole society benefits from free public transport. And if we had, and this is built on the same principle as free education, free health service, and if we had high quality bus services that were freely available to all, this would make for a much more inclusive, equal, healthier and greener society. Next slide. Thank you. So there are numerous benefits from having quality public transport and free public transport. So firstly, social, that's probably the most important. It improves social connections, it enables access, reduces loneliness and isolation, and improves life opportunities for a lot of people. It improves health as well. People that use the bus tend to have a lower body mass index than people who drive. And for children who go to school by public transport rather than by car, they have a lower percentage of body fat. Environmental. If we need to get people out of cars and onto public transport and active travel. This can reduce carbon, congestion, pollution, as well as all the casualties associated with road traffic. If we're going to meet our carbon targets by 2030, we need to shift millions of journeys out of cars, millions of car kilometres onto public transport and active travel. And lastly, economic. Free public transport can give people access to jobs, education and training. Before COVID, I think 1 in 10 bus commuters would not be able to get to work without that bus service. They depend on that bus service. It also provides more economic opportunities. It gives employers a wider pool of people to choose from, and obviously benefits tourism, as I said before. Next slide, please. So here are some arguments against free bus fares, and you're going to hear these, and you may as well, try and address them or counter them where you can. So the number one, of course, is the cost, the significant cost. About 22 billion black hole, and public finances being really stretched. I'll come back to that in a little while. The second point, it's better to spend money on improving bus services and reliability rather than spending money on free bus fares. The bigger picture here is that we need to provide high quality bus services for everyone, and free fares are part of that. We need to make it attractive for people to take public transport. We also need to spend money on investing in improving bus services and public transport all over the UK. It's pretty dire everywhere in the UK outside London. And we need to improve reliability. But free bus fares and free public transport are part of that. They have a particular advantage. They remove one of the barriers for people getting out of their cars and onto public transport. And it helps to level up transport in the UK. It's very unequal at the moment. The third argument you might hear is the flat £2 fare is better. This is outside England, where bus fares tend to be £4 or £5. Yes, £2 bus fare is better than £4 or £5, but it's still not ideal if you have to take 2 or 3 buses somewhere and 2 or 3 buses back again. Another argument, it's going to make peak time buses too crowded. Well, the answer to that is there's lots of capacity on buses, particularly outside London. It's better to have a crowded bus than to have congestion and be late for work. And here's a radical idea. We can put on more buses if they're too crowded. And then the last argument is it undermines active travel. Yes, some people who walk or cycle now may take the bus if it's free, but I think this will be outweighed by a much greater number of people who are going to be walking as a result of taking buses in the future. Next slide, please. So how much will it cost? So these figures are for England, outside London, London and England total. And the figures on the right-hand side show the public subsidy as a percentage of the revenue. And I think what a lot of people forget is that the private commercial operators, which are generally most of the bus operators in England, they're heavily subsidised by the public purse. Around 2/5 of their revenue comes from the public purse already. The figures on the left in red show the current fare, and that's 2023 figures, fare revenue in England and London. That's how much revenue the bus operators took in. And that's pretty much roughly how much you'd need to replace if you're going to go for free bus fares. But it depends how it's done, whether you're talking about a regulated bus system or an unregulated one. So outside of London, it's mostly deregulated. The commercial bus operators to extract a higher percentage of profits than the regulated bus operators in London. So if you're doing it within a regulated system, it's going to cost less because less money is leaking out to shareholders. And if you have municipal buses owned by the public sector, then obviously it will cost less again because all of those profits are plowed back into the bus network. So 3.1 billion, it sounds a lot of money, but just to put that into perspective, at the last budget in March, the government failed to increase fuel duty again, and this cost the Exchequer around £5 billion. And that's a regressive tax, so it's not putting up fuel duty by 5 pence. It's a regressive tax because it benefits the higher income drivers more than the lower income drivers. And there's estimates that showed that measure, it benefited higher income drivers by about £60 a year and it benefited lower income drivers by £20 a year. But that's just one example. Next slide, please. So we do need to find the funding to pay for free fares. It's true, and we need to find the funding for pay for better public transport services. But the problem is, we are a wealthy country. There is ample wealth in the UK. It's just distributed evenly. And we're not taxing the right thing. And there's we can't raise revenue, that we've got this tiny little pot of money and it has to be divvied up between lots of different needy public services. And what we say is there's lots of potential revenue sources out there, some of them transport, some of them not transport. We can easily raise the revenue if we have the political will. And we're advocating shifting tax from environmental and climate bads, things that make climate change worse and make the environment worse, to climate goods. So I think I've got that wrong again. Sorry, shifting from goods to, we want to shift the taxation from goods to bads. Oh, sorry, it should say shifting tax from goods to bads, sorry. And there's a few examples there. Simon already mentioned 15 billion on only 18 road schemes alone. So we can reallocate road spending. We can introduce road user charging. This could replace fuel duty. That will cost billions of pounds or raise billions of pounds. We can tax aviation fuel in the same way that we tax petrol. Fuel duty on aviation fuel, that's 6.7 billion a year. We can put a higher tax on people that travel by polluting private jets. That could raise an estimated 1.4 billion a year. And there's lots of others. We can increase tax SUV. We can remove tax breaks for workplace parking. We can capture more of the windfall profits from land value increases when we build, tube stations and train stations, and housing developments. We can introduce tourism taxes. They've got one in Manchester. They're going to have one in Edinburgh. We can have it all over England, in London. So there's lots of examples that we're working on currently. We're trying to estimate how much we could raise, and we reckon about 40 billion a year in transport taxes on climate bads. So this could pay for significantly enhanced public transport as well as free fares. Next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah. So to conclude, there's the case for free fares and better public transport. There's lots of reasons why we need to do this. We can pay for it. The revenue is there. We just need the political will. And that's where campaigns like yours come in, is to generate the momentum behind these measures to try and raise the revenue to get these things in place, so we can all have a world-class system. And you can join the movement of other environmental and climate and transport campaign groups who are all fighting for a world-class public transport system. Thank you.
Yeah. Lovely. Thank you very much. My name is Daniel Randall. I'm a train driver on London Underground and the assistant branch secretary of the Bakerloo Line branch. And we were the first RMT branch, I think maybe the first branch of any trade union, to formally support the Fare Free London campaign. And since then, one other branch on the Underground, Central and East, and our regional council, the London Transport Regional Council, have both backed the campaign. And the backing of that latter body is quite significant, at least symbolically. So we're the region, the London Transport Region. We represent about 15,000 workers across Transport for London and its subsidiary companies like London Underground, who I work for. So fundamentally, my support for this policy is political. I'm a socialist, and I believe in driving the logic of the market and commodification out of as many spheres of life as possible, and especially out of the provision of public services. But I've got limited time today, so I'm not going to talk too much about the demand for free transport of a transitional program towards socialism. I'm going to focus on what it would mean for us as transport workers and why I think those of us who work on the Underground and who've kind of promoted this policy and this campaign in our union have done so. So I think we have to consider this question, the abolition of fares, in the context of the broader question of how public transport in London is funded and run. And give a very whistle-stop tour of some recent history on that. So until 2015, a central source, the primary source of funding for TfL, was a central government grant, a subsidy that it received on an annual basis. The Tory government of 2015 made a manifest commitment to scrap that. They reduced it incrementally until it was abolished entirely in 2018. So from 2018 to 2020, TfL was forced onto a so-called self-financing funding model where 75% of its income came from fares. Now, this is completely unheard of in terms of equivalent metropolitan transport systems of this type. So, in comparison, income from fare revenue represents less than half, around 40% of the total income stream of the New York metro system or the Paris metro system. When the pandemic hit and fare revenue obviously collapsed necessarily, it's your arm getting tired. No, I can do it. So when the pandemic hit and fare revenue obviously collapsed, 75% of TfL's income streams vaporized overnight. The government bailed TfL out with a series of emergency payments, but all of them came with significant strings and conditions, including requirements to cut staffing levels, reform our staff pension scheme, things that we've been on strike over multiple times and are still in dispute about today, as well as a commitment to return to being self-financing, once the emergency bailouts expired. So for me, for those of us who supported the policy in my branch and in our regional council, for us, the demand for free public transport is an extension, maybe a radical extension, but a logical one, of our union's long-standing demand for the public subsidy to TfL to be restored. Funding TfL via public subsidy cuts against the logic of commodification. If we're going to extend, so why not extend that public subsidy to a sufficient level to facilitate the abolition of fares entirely? And doing that would free us from the whims of the kind of commodified retail model that we've been forced onto for several years, where a dip in footfall and therefore fare revenue can be used by bosses as a pretext for cutting staffing levels and attacking conditions. Now, in the interests of full disclosure, I should say that when the resolution from the London Transport Regional Council was submitted to our National Executive Committee, the NT voted down. It's probably worth saying words about the reasons why, because I think it's indicative of the kind of arguments we're going to need to take on and win to win this policy across the labour movement and especially in transport sector unions like mine. So the NEC basically took the view that jobs in the transport sector depend on fare revenue. So it was self-defeating for us as a transport union to publicly support the call for the abolition of fares. Now, this is, in my view, a fundamentally conservative position. It accepts the current funding system, which has commodification at its core, as an immutable fact rather than a political choice. My union's rule book commits us as a union to, quote, work for the supersession of the capitalist system by a socialistic order of society. And there's no vision of socialism, as I understand it, in which you still have to pay to get on a bus or take the train. The NEC position also referred to job security for RMT members currently working in revenue collection as revenue inspectors on underground or on trains. But just as the union now has policy to demand worker-led transition and conversion programs for members working in offshore energy, away from fossil fuel extraction and towards renewables, I think we ought to be able to imagine a transition model for these workers into other roles in the transport system. So we've got some way to go in terms of winning the argument, not just in society in general, but in our union, certainly at NEC level. But as a workforce that's been through years of disputes, still going through disputes against cuts that ultimately stem from the consequences of this self-financing funding model, I think my workmates are open to discussion about a different way of doing things. And whilst I wish to sow no illusions about the progressive potential or the character of the Starmer government, I do think that getting the Tories out does create a somewhat expanded space for having those discussions and for making arguments like the one this campaign wants to make, argument that perhaps the market and profit motive and the commodification of public life are not forces of nature, but rather constructs, choices that we could dismantle and establish in their place new constructs based on social ownership and free and accessible provision. So I'm looking forward to the discussions that we'll have here today about how best to advance those arguments and to win that future. Thank you very much.